There's a family in America whose name you'll never find in any history book, not because they were insignificant, but because tracing their bloodline requires you to accept that some families don't just have secrets, they are the secret. A genealogical nightmare where every branch leads to a different truth, where DNA tells one story and documentation tells another, and where the very concept of family becomes a weapon used across generations. This isn't about a single scandal or a hidden affair. This is about a mountain community where the traditional rules of kinship collapsed entirely, where children grew up unable to answer the simplest question a human can ask: who am I? The records exist, fragmented, contradictory, and deliberately obscured, but they exist, and what they reveal is a bloodline so tangled, so psychologically devastating, that even professional genealogists have walked away from the case, unable to reconcile what the evidence shows. This is the story of the Mountain Bloodline with a history too complicated to track. In the isolated hollows of central Appalachia, there was a family, we'll call them the Carters, though that name itself is contested, who lived according to rules the outside world stopped following centuries ago. By the 1920s, when the first serious attempts were made to document their lineage, researchers encountered something that shouldn't have been possible in modern America. Birth records that listed mothers who were simultaneously listed as sisters. Marriage licenses where the bride and groom shared the same parents but different birth years that made the mathematics impossible. Children who appeared in census records under 3 different surnames in 3 consecutive decades. This wasn't mere record-keeping error. This was systematic, intentional obscurity, and beneath it lay a family structure so complex, so deeply intertwined with itself, that the very concept of a family tree became meaningless. What grew in those mountains wasn't a tree, it was a web, and everyone born into it was caught. The first thing you need to understand is that isolation does something to human communities that we're only beginning to comprehend. When the outside world finally penetrated deep enough into those mountain communities to ask questions, what they found wasn't just poverty or backwardness. It was a complete parallel system of family organization that had evolved in almost total isolation for over 100 years. The Carters, and the dozen or so families they were entangled with, had created something anthropologists still struggle to categorize. A kinship system where traditional labels like uncle, cousin, and brother had lost all meaning. Where a single man might be simultaneously grandfather, father, and uncle to the same child through different lineages. Where women bore children to multiple men within the same family cluster, not out of chaos, but following an internal logic the outside world couldn't parse. The first researcher who tried to map this family was a social worker from the State Welfare Office in 1923. Her name was Margaret Donnelly, and her assignment was simple: determine which children in the hollow were eligible for the newly established Mother's Pension Program. She spent 6 weeks in those mountains. Her report, when she finally submitted it, was 17 pages of increasingly desperate attempts to create a coherent family tree. On page 12, she abandoned the effort entirely. Her final notation reads, "The family structure here defies standard documentation. Children claim parents who could not biologically be their parents. Adults provide contradictory information about their own siblings. I cannot, in good conscience, certify any of these relationships as factual." Margaret Donnelly requested a transfer the following month. She never returned to the mountains, and her report was quietly filed away, marked as inconclusive. But the children were real. The families were real. And the question remained, how does a bloodline become so complicated that trained professionals cannot map it? The answer lies in something darker than simple isolation. It lies in deliberate concealment. Because what was happening in those mountains wasn't accidental, it was systematic, and it had been happening for generations before anyone from the outside world ever arrived to ask questions. The Carters weren't confused about their lineage. They knew exactly what they were. They simply knew that the truth could never be spoken aloud, not to outsiders, not even in many cases to their own children. By the 1930s, the federal government became involved. The Roosevelt administration's rural survey programs sent teams of researchers into Appalachia to document living conditions, and when they reached the Carter Hollow, they encountered what their reports described as a genealogical impossibility. One researcher, a man named Thomas Wickham, spent 3 months attempting to interview family members. His field notes reveal a growing psychological distress. He writes about children who, when asked about their parents, would go silent and stare at the ground. About women who would give different names for their children's fathers depending on who was asking. About men who claimed to be brothers but whose ages were 30 years apart. Wickham's final report included a hand-drawn chart that he himself labeled as approximately 40% conjecture. In his concluding paragraph, he wrote something that still haunts researchers today. "I believe these people know the truth. I believe they have always known. But the truth has become so shameful, so legally and morally indefensible, that they have collectively agreed to forget it. And in forgetting, they have made it impossible for anyone to remember." What Wickham was documenting, though he likely didn't have the framework to understand it, was intergenerational trauma made genealogical. The Carter bloodline wasn't just complicated, it was actively self-destructing. Each generation added new layers of concealment, new contradictions, new impossible relationships that couldn't exist according to the laws of biology and society. And yet, they did exist. The children grew up. They had children of their own, and the web grew denser. DNA testing didn't exist yet. Blood typing was rudimentary, so there was no objective way to cut through the lies and the silence and the shame. There was only testimony, and testimony in the Carter Hollow was a weapon people used to protect themselves from truths too devastating to acknowledge. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Because researchers eventually discovered that the confusion wasn't limited to the living. When they began examining cemetery records and death certificates from the 19th century, they found the same patterns, the same impossible relationships, the same genealogical contradictions. This wasn't a recent development. This wasn't something that happened because of isolation or poverty or lack of education. This was the family's foundation. The bloodline had been tangled from the very beginning, and every generation had simply inherited the tangle and made it worse. The question wasn't how the family became this way. The question was, had they ever been any other way? Or was this chaos the original design? In 1946, a graduate student from the University of Kentucky named Elizabeth Marsh attempted what no one else had successfully done. She tried to construct a complete Carter family genealogy going back to the family's origins in the 1780s. She worked for 2 years. She interviewed over 60 family members. She examined every available document, church records, land deeds, tax rolls, census data, court proceedings. What she discovered wasn't just complexity. It was evidence of deliberate erasure. Names that appeared in one record would be completely different in another from the same year. Children who were listed as orphans in church baptismal records but appeared living with both parents in census date taken months earlier. Most disturbingly, she found patterns of what she called generational role reversal, children being raised as siblings to their own parents, grandparents claiming to be aunts and uncles, entire family units restructuring themselves every decade to hide relationships that had become legally or socially untenable. Elizabeth Marsh's thesis was rejected by her academic committee, not because her research was flawed, but because her conclusions were too disturbing. She had documented what she believed was systematic, multi-generational incest being concealed through calculated manipulation of public records. Her committee chair told her privately that publishing such findings would destroy her career and potentially expose the family to prosecution or violence. The thesis was sealed. Elizabeth Marsh left academia and never published her research. But her notes survived. And in those notes, she wrote something that crystallizes the horror of the Carter bloodline. These people didn't just break taboos. They built an entire family system designed to make taboo breaking invisible. Every child born into this family is born into a lie they will spend their entire life maintaining. The bloodline isn't complicated because of ignorance. It's complicated because complexity is the only defense they have against the truth. The truth. Let's talk about what the truth actually was. Because by the 1950s, when blood typing became more sophisticated and when researchers could cross-reference medical records with family testimony, a picture began to emerge. The Carter bloodline wasn't a traditional family tree with a few scandalous branches. It was a closed genetic loop. Multiple family lines had been intermarrying, interbreeding, folding back on themselves for so many generations that the genetic distance between unrelated members was often less than that between typical first cousins. Children were being born with recessive genetic conditions at rates that shocked medical professionals, but even more disturbing was the psychological architecture that had been built to sustain this system. The family had developed an entire culture of silence, misdirection, and strategic amnesia. Don't ask about your father. Don't question why your sister looks so much like your mother's mother. Don't count the years between births. Don't compare stories, and above all, don't tell outsiders. By the 1960s, the Carter family had begun to fracture. Younger generations were leaving the mountains, moving to cities, marrying outsiders. And when they did, many of them began asking questions they'd been trained never to ask. One woman, born in the Hollow in 1941, didn't learn the truth about her parentage until she was 47 years old. She had grown up believing her grandmother was her mother, that her mother was her sister. The truth came out during a family funeral, whispered by an elderly aunt who was dying and wanted, finally, to unburden herself. The woman's actual father was the man she'd called uncle her entire life. Her biological mother had been 14 when she gave birth. The pregnancy had been hidden, the baby absorbed into the family structure as a late child, born to the grandmother. This wasn't an isolated case. This was the standard operating procedure. Researchers who interviewed former Carter family members in the 1970s and 80s heard the same story again and again. Identities revealed decades too late. Siblings who were actually parents, parents who were actually cousins or uncles or grandfathers, an entire generation raised inside a hole of mirrors where every reflection was a lie. And here's what makes this truly devastating: many of these people didn't want to know the truth. When confronted with evidence, blood types that didn't match, documents that contradicted the stories they'd been told, they rejected it, because accepting the truth meant accepting that their entire identity was fiction. It meant accepting that they might be the product of relationships so taboo that even speaking them aloud felt like a crime. It meant looking at their own children and wondering what genetic damage might be hidden in their DNA, what recessive nightmares might emerge in future generations. The truth wasn't liberation. The truth was a curse, and many chose to die still clinging to the lies. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because what we're discussing isn't abstract history. This family still exists. Their descendants are alive today, many of them still untangling the genealogical nightmare they inherited. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you want to know the truth, or would you choose the mercy of not asking questions that can never be unanswered? The modern era brought DNA testing, and DNA testing brought something the Carter family had avoided for 2 centuries: objective truth. In the early 2000s, several family members submitted their DNA to genealogy databases, hoping to clarify their ancestry. What they found instead was confirmation of their worst fears. The genetic analysis revealed exactly what researchers had suspected. Generations of close relative reproduction, genetic markers that indicated parent-child relationships where official records claimed distant cousins, shared DNA segments that could only result from repeated, systematic inbreeding over multiple generations. One genetic counselor who reviewed the results described it as one of the most genetically isolated family groups in modern American history. The family hadn't just been complicated, they had been, for all practical purposes, breeding themselves into a genetic dead end. The psychological damage didn't end with the revelation of genetic truth. For many Carter descendants, DNA testing opened wounds that had never properly healed, wounds that had been passed down like heirlooms through generations. Therapists who worked with these families in the 2000s and 2010s reported something they called genealogical PTSD, a trauma response triggered not by personal experience, but by the discovery of ancestral sin. People who learned the truth about their bloodline experienced symptoms identical to abuse survivors: intrusive thoughts, shame spirals, difficulty trusting their own memories, because their memories weren't reliable. Everything they'd been told about who they were had been constructed to protect them from a truth their ancestors believed would destroy them, and in many cases it did. Depression rates among Carter descendants who pursued DNA testing were significantly higher than the general population. Several went through identity crises so severe they legally changed their names, cut off contact with all family members, tried to erase themselves from the very bloodline that had already erased them once before. But here's what haunts researchers most. The Carter family wasn't unique. As DNA testing became more widespread, as genealogical databases grew, similar patterns emerged in isolated communities across Appalachia, in rural sections of the Deep South, in mountain communities out west. The Carter bloodline wasn't an aberration, it was an example, proof that when you isolate human beings long enough, when you remove social oversight and external accountability, family structures can evolve into something monstrous. Something that sustains itself through secrecy and shame, that turns children into accomplices to their own erasure, that makes love and abuse indistinguishable. These weren't monsters. They were people trapped in a system they inherited and didn't know how to escape. But the damage they inflicted was real, and it compounded across generations until the family itself became a kind of prison, one with bars made of blood relation and locked doors made of silence. Modern Carter descendants face an impossible choice. They can pursue the truth, submit their DNA, trace their lineage back through the lies and the contradictions and the deliberate obscurity, and potentially discover things about their own origins that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Or they can choose what their ancestors chose, willful unknowing, the comfort of not asking questions, the safety of accepting the official story, even when every instinct tells them it's a fiction. There's no right answer. Because the damage has already been done, the bloodline is what it is. The children who were born into this tangle didn't ask for it. They didn't deserve it. But they carry it in their DNA, in their family names, in the gaps in their family trees that can never be filled. And they have to decide, each of them individually, whether knowing the truth is worth the cost of that knowledge. In 2019, a journalist attempted to write a comprehensive history of the Carter family. She traveled to the hollow where it all began, now mostly abandoned, the old homesteads collapsing into the forest floor. She interviewed 12 surviving family members willing to speak on record, and what she heard over and over was a kind of exhausted resignation. These weren't people ashamed of their ancestors anymore. They were people tired of carrying secrets that were never theirs to begin with. One man, 63 years old, told her, "I spent 40 years trying to figure out who my daddy was. I finally got the answer from a DNA test. Turns out he was my grandfather too, and you know what the worst part is? I wasn't even surprised. Some part of me always knew, we all knew. We just didn't have the words for what we knew." The journalist's article was never published. The family members who had agreed to interviews contacted her and asked her not to, not because they were threatened, but because they realized that no amount of explanation could make the outside world understand what it was like to be born into a genealogical nightmare and expected to just live with it. The Carter bloodline still exists. It's still too complicated to track in any meaningful way, because at a certain point, when enough lies have been layered on top of each other, when enough identities have been falsified and enough relationships concealed, the truth becomes irretrievable. You can't untangle a knot that's been tightening for 200 years. You can't reconstruct a family tree when the roots themselves are poisoned. What you can do is bear witness. You can acknowledge that this happened, that families like the Carters existed and still exist, that isolation and shame and secrecy can twist human relationships into shapes that shouldn't be possible, and that the children born into these systems deserve compassion, not judgment. They didn't create the tangle, they were born already caught in it. There's a cemetery in those mountains where many of the Carters are buried. The headstones are simple, weathered, many of them illegible now. The names that can still be read repeat across generations, the same 5 or 6 surnames appearing again and again, intermarrying, folding back on themselves in the ground the same way they did in life. Visitors who find this cemetery often report feeling unsettled, though they can't articulate why. Maybe it's the repetition, the sense that you're looking at a family that consumed itself, or maybe it's something simpler and more human. The recognition that beneath every headstone is someone who lived their entire life inside a lie they couldn't escape, someone who loved and suffered and died without ever knowing the full truth of who they were. The Mountain Bloodline, with a history too complicated to track, isn't just a genealogical curiosity. It's a testament to what humans will do to protect themselves from truths too terrible to face, and a reminder that sometimes the most horrifying thing a family can pass down isn't a secret. It's the obligation to keep that secret, generation after generation, until the secret becomes the only inheritance that matters. The Carter family story doesn't have an ending because the bloodline continues. Complicated, tangled, and utterly impossible to fully understand.